March 1st, 2026. This morning, while most people were still scrolling through their phones half awake, something was quietly circulating through the entertainment industry, through legal circles, through the specific network of people who have spent the last several months watching the Diddy situation with the kind of careful, measured attention that powerful people pay to things that have the potential to reach them. A story, a narrative being pushed through the usual back channels, yet through the whisper networks that have always served as the unofficial communication infrastructure of the music and entertainment world. The story being circulated was this: Sean Combs is still making millions from prison by renting out his private jet, still untouchable, still the boss, still running the machine from behind bars, still dangerous, still relevant, still here. And here is what you need to understand about that story before we go any further. When power is real, it does not issue press releases about itself. When influence is genuine, it does not require whisper campaigns to remind people that it exists. When someone can actually reach you, hurt you, reward you, or destroy you, you do not need to be told. You feel it. Real power is felt in the room before it opens its mouth. What we are watching right now on this first day of March 2026, as the legal situation surrounding Sean Combs continues to develop in ways that are reshaping what is possible to say publicly about him and the people connected to him, is not power. It is the performance of power by a man who has realized that the performance may be all he has left. And that realization, that specific, desperate recognition that the gap between what you were and what you are has become impossible to bridge with anything except theater. That is the story we are actually telling today. Before we go any deeper, make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and hit the bell icon so you never miss a breakdown like this one. Now let us get all the way into it. Let us start exactly where the noise started. The claim being floated through industry sources and entertainment blogs in the last several days is that Diddy is still generating millions every single month from prison. Well, the mechanism being cited is his private jet, the luxury aircraft that once symbolized everything about what it meant to be inside his orbit, to be chosen, to be protected, to be someone whose calls got returned and whose name opened doors in every city in the world. That jet, the story goes, is still flying, still being rented out, still generating income. Still proof that Sean Combs remains financially untouchable regardless of what is happening inside MDC Brooklyn. It is a compelling image. Once it is designed to be. Someone with significant experience in constructing public narratives put thought into this particular story and the specific emotional response it was meant to produce. The image of a man behind bars whose assets are still working, still productive, still generating wealth without his physical presence required. That is the image of someone whose power exists at a structural level rather than a personal one. That is the image of someone whose reach has been institutionalized into systems that continue operating independently. That is, in other words, the image of someone you should still be afraid of. Except the image does not survive contact with the simplest possible question. Who is renting it? Not rhetorically, literally. Name one corporation that is currently putting its brand name on a passenger manifest tied to Sean Combs. But name one celebrity whose publicist has signed off on them being photographed boarding a jet associated with an ongoing federalist situation that involves allegations of the nature and scale currently attached to this case. Name one executive, one influencer, one business entity of any consequence that has looked at their legal team, their PR team, their board of directors, or their investor relationships and said, yes, this is the asset we want to be publicly affiliated with right now. Name one. You cannot, because they do not exist. And the reason they do not exist is not complicated. That jet is not a luxury asset in the current environment. It is a liability with wings. Any involvement with it, any association with it, any proximity to it creates questions that nobody in a legitimate business operation wants to answer. Why were you there? Who else was there? What was the purpose of the flight? Were you aware of the federal proceedings? Do you have any documentation? Can you account for the dates? These are not hypothetical questions. These are the kinds of questions that attorneys, investigators, and congressional offices have been asking people connected to the situation since the first charges were filed, and the list of people being asked those questions is not getting shorter. So when there is a no visible demand, when there are no public charter confirmations, when there are no third-party companies proudly attaching their names to this arrangement, when the entire claim rests on allegedly, and sources say and reportedly, what you are looking at is not income reporting. It is signaling. It is a story constructed not to document a financial reality, but to create the impression of one. And the impression is targeted. It has specific audiences in mind. It is not primarily aimed at you. The blogs, the commentary, the chatter on social media, that is collateral. That is the noise that gets generated when you throw something into the ecosystem and wait to see where it lands. The real audience for this narrative is considerably closer to home. Understand how prison economics actually work, because this is the layer that most coverage of this situation has completely missed. Inside MDC Brooklyn, inside any federal detention facility where high-profile inmates are housed, the currency that matters is not reputation in the abstract. It is not legacy. It is not Grammy Awards or Forbes covers or the kind of cultural mythology that accumulates around a name like Diddy across 3 decades of dominance. None of that means anything in that environment in any direct, practical sense. What matters is money. Specifically, what matters is the ongoing, credible belief that money is still flowing, that the commissary will be stocked, that favors will be returned, that the people around you have reason to believe that maintaining a relationship with you is worth something in concrete terms. Respect in prison is not emotional. It is transactional. And transactions require belief in the solvency of the other party. If people inside that facility believe that Combs' cash flow is strong, that his outside support structure is intact, that he can still send money to families, still look out for people who look out for him, we still make life more comfortable for those who choose to be in proximity to him, then the assumption holds. The arrangement continues, the protection persists, the peace is maintained. But the moment that belief wavers, the moment the question becomes real rather than rhetorical, is the money actually coming, or is this man's financial situation more compromised than he is letting on? Everything changes. Not slowly, fast. Because in that environment, information travels at the speed of rumor, and rumor travels at the speed of consequence. Respect in prison is rented, not owned. It renews on a rolling basis. Miss a payment, miss an expectation, fail to deliver on what people have come to assume you are capable of delivering, and the energy in the room shifts before you have time to manage it. Suddenly, the conversations are different. The body language is different. The small calculations that people make dozens of times a day about who they stand near and who they avoid start producing different answers. And once that shift happens inside a facility, there is no PR team in the world that can reverse it. There is no narrative that reaches inside those walls fast enough to stop the recalibration once it has started. This is why the Jet story is being floated right now on March 1st, 2026, at this specific moment in the arc of this situation. This is not about income. This is about maintenance. This is image PR performed in public for an audience that lives behind bars. The story is a signal sent through the only channels that can reach that audience, the entertainment media ecosystem that inmates follow through tablets, through phone calls, through the conversations that flow in when people on the outside talk to people on the inside. The message being sent through all of that noise is simple. The money is still there. I am still funded. I can still reach you. Do not change your calculations. But here is where the desperation becomes visible to anyone paying close attention. Real power does not need to send that message. Real power does not need to remind its beneficiaries that it is still operational. The confidence required to maintain a power structure inside a detention facility comes from consistency, from demonstrated ongoing capacity, from the actual reliable flow of resources and protection that people have come to depend on. You do not build that by floating a story about a jet through entertainment blogs. You build it through showing up month after month in ways that are felt rather than read about. The fact that the story is being told at all, the fact that the narrative is being constructed rather than demonstrated, is the tell. It is the loudest possible signal that the demonstration is no longer possible. And this is where the financial reality underneath the performance becomes impossible to ignore. Because the actual financial situation of Sean Combs in March 2026 is not the situation that existed 3 years ago, or 5 years ago, or at any point before the federal charges, the civil suits, the asset scrutiny, because the legal fees that have been accumulating at a rate that would strain the resources of individuals with considerably more liquid wealth than even the most generous estimates of his fortune. Frozen accounts are not theoretical. Legal exposure in civil cases involving multiple plaintiffs creates financial liability that does not wait for a criminal conviction to become real. The attorneys representing him in a case of this complexity and scale do not work on goodwill. But the costs of mounting a federal defense at this level are staggering and ongoing. And all of that is before accounting for the assets that have been placed under various forms of legal scrutiny, the properties that have complicated ownership histories, the business entities that have found themselves named in various proceedings, the partnerships that have quietly dissolved rather than be publicly associated with what this name now means. The gap between the image of ongoing millions and the reality of ongoing legal and financial pressure is real, and it is significant, and the people who need to believe in the image are exactly the people best positioned to sense that the image is not matching the reality. That mismatch is dangerous, and the attempt to paper over it with a jet story is the kind of move that reveals more about the desperation of the person making it than it conceals about the underlying situation. There is another audience being addressed by this narrative that the coverage has been almost entirely silent about. His family, the people who carry the name and who are now being positioned, according to what people close to the situation are saying, as the next generation of brand stewardship. The framing being offered publicly is legacy planning, the passing of the torch, the natural evolution of a dynasty toward its next phase. But the people who have been watching this situation closely are describing it in different terms. What they are seeing is not mentorship. It is emergency delegation, not the considered intentional preparation of successors who have been given real authority, real decision-making power, real opportunity to build and fail and learn on their own terms. It is the sudden and urgent transfer of impossible expectations onto people who were never actually given the tools to carry them. For years, because the people closest to him were positioned as adjacencies rather than principals, present but not empowered, loyal but not trained for leadership, part of the brand without being architects of it. That works when the central figure is present, functional, and fully operational. It becomes a crisis when the central figure is removed from the equation and the people who were supposed to be the next generation of the empire discover that what they inherited was not a system with genuine structural integrity, but a personality-driven apparatus that only functioned because of the specific individual at its center. You cannot hand stewardship of something like that to people who were never given real agency within it and expect the transition to hold. You can ask for loyalty, but you cannot manufacture competence on a timeline driven by legal urgency rather than genuine readiness. What this exposes is another fracture in the foundation that the Jet story is trying to conceal. Real dynasties survive transitions. They survive them because they are built with the transition in mind, because the people who will carry it forward have been genuinely developed and genuinely empowered over time. Fragile structures, structures built on the centralized authority of a single dominant personality, collapse when that personality is removed. They do not transition, they dissolve, and the dissolution is not dramatic. It is quiet, incremental, and characterized exactly by the kind of desperate maintenance activity we are watching unfold right now on March 1st, 2026, as someone tries to freeze a collapsing structure in place through narrative control rather than structural rebuilding. Let us talk about what that jet actually represents now in this moment, stripped of the mythology that once surrounded it, because it is worth spending time on, because the transformation of that symbol from what it was to what it has become tells the entire story of this situation in miniature. 3 years ago, 5 years ago, being invited onto that jet meant something specific and desirable. It meant you were inside the circle. It meant you had access that others did not. It meant that your relationship with the person at the center of that world was close enough and valued enough to warrant that level of proximity. There was an entire economy of meaning built around it. The jet was not transportation. It was affiliation, status, protection, and an implicit statement about where you stood in a particular hierarchy of power and access. Today, we think appearing on a passenger manifest connected to that aircraft would trigger an immediate and uncomfortable series of questions from every professional relationship in your life, your legal counsel, your business partners, your publicist, your investors if you have them, your label or studio if you operate in the entertainment space, your corporate sponsors if you are a public-facing personality. Every single one of those relationships would require you to explain yourself. Michael, and the explanation would not be comfortable or simple, and the act of having to provide it would create exactly the kind of association that people spend significant money and effort trying to avoid in the current climate. The jet has gone from being a symbol of desirable proximity to being a symbol of dangerous proximity. That inversion is total, and it is permanent. Luxury does not always disappear overnight. Sometimes it transforms into liability while still wearing the costume of luxury. And that is exactly what has happened here. The moment that transformation completes, the moment people stop seeing the symbol as aspirational and start seeing it as radioactive, the entire structure that was built around it begins to erode from the outside in. The people who maintained relationships with the center of that structure out of genuine belief in its power start running the calculation differently. The risk side of the equation has changed. The benefit side has also changed. When both move in the wrong direction simultaneously, rational actors update their behavior. They do not announce the update. They simply become less available. The calls take longer to return. The responses become shorter and more carefully worded. The in-person presence becomes increasingly rare and increasingly conditional. And in the specific ecosystem we are talking about, in an industry that runs on access and relationships and the unstated mutual understanding of who owes what to whom, these shifts communicate everything while saying nothing. This is the quiet phase of a power structure's collapse. It does not look like what people expect. People expect drama. They expect confrontation, public denunciations, the kind of visible rupture that makes for compelling content and clear narrative. What actually happens is much more mundane and much more devastating. People just stop showing up. They get busy. They have other priorities. Boy, they are supportive in principle, but unavailable in practice. And gradually, the apparatus that required ongoing human participation to function finds itself with less and less of that participation, and the things that depended on it begin to slow and stall and eventually cease. The fear economy that sustained this structure for decades is undergoing exactly this kind of quiet dissolution right now. Fear only functions as a control mechanism when the people being controlled believe two things simultaneously. First, that the person doing the controlling has the capacity to enforce consequences. Second, that the cost of noncompliance exceeds the cost of compliance. For a very long time, both of those conditions held in this particular ecosystem. The enforcement capacity was real, and people had experienced it or witnessed it or heard enough credible accounts of it to take it seriously. And the cost of noncompliance, the career damage, the social exile, the legal complications, the very real professional consequences of being seen as someone who had crossed this particular line was understood to be substantial. Both of those conditions are now in question in ways they have never been before. But the enforcement capacity of a man in federal detention facing the legal situation currently facing Sean Combs is not the enforcement capacity of a man at the height of his operational freedom and power. The tools available to him have been drastically curtailed. The people who would have executed consequences on his behalf are now running their own calculations about the costs and benefits of continued association. And the cost of noncompliance, the thing that kept people in line for decades, It has been fundamentally reframed by the public nature of what has emerged about the conditions under which that compliance was maintained. It is considerably harder to fear the consequences of crossing someone when the entire apparatus of fear is being examined in detail by federal investigators and described in civil complaints that are a matter of public record. When fear stops working as a control mechanism, which the people who were relying on it as their primary tool of influence face a specific and irreversible problem. They cannot simply replace it with something else. Fear built over decades through consistent demonstration of consequence cannot be swapped out on short notice for something more sustainable and positive. The relationships that were structured around intimidation and leverage do not gracefully transition into something built on genuine mutual benefit when the intimidation capacity disappears. They do not transform, they dissolve. The loyalty that was maintained through fear is not actually loyalty, it is rational compliance with a coercive system, and rational compliance disappears the moment the coercion is removed. What replaces it in the specific social environment we are examining? Wiki is self-preservation. And self-preservation, unlike coerced compliance, is vocal. Not immediately, not dramatically, not in public press conferences or emotional tell-all interviews, but in the quiet, careful, attorney-supervised conversations that happen when people who are adjacent to a collapsing power structure start to seriously consider their own exposure. So in the documents that get organized, in the devices that get replaced, in the careful review of past communications that happens when people realize they need to understand their own situation before someone else defines it for them. In the meetings with counsel that happen behind closed doors and that have nothing dramatic to announce, but that represent a fundamental shift in the direction of information flow. This is the phase we are in right now. This is what March 1st, into 2026 actually represents in the arc of this situation. Not a dramatic new revelation, not a shocking public moment. The procedural, methodical consolidation of a legal situation that has been building in exactly this direction for a considerable period of time. The investigators working this case have not stopped working because the headlines have quieted. The attorneys representing the civil plaintiffs have not slowed their activity because the public attention has moved on to other stories. The financial forensics being conducted on the various entities connected to this situation have not paused because the jet story started circulating. All of that work continues quietly, procedurally, with the patience and thoroughness that characterizes serious federal legal proceedings rather than media cycles. And here is what that means for everyone who was in proximity to the situation over the years. Not just the people at the center of it, the people adjacent to it, the people who benefited from its network effects, the people who looked the other way because looking the other way was safer and more profitable than asking questions, the people who knew things they did not act on, the people who attended events, participated in arrangements, received benefits from systems they did not fully examine. All of those people are now running the same calculation. Is the story I have been telling myself about my own involvement accurate? Well, if someone examined my conduct during that period, what would they find? Am I better served by proactive transparency or by continued silence? And is continued silence even possible at this point, given how much the landscape has shifted? That last question is the one that matters most, because the answer is changing. The landscape in which silence was the rational choice has been fundamentally altered by the public emergence of details that give other people, each people with their own knowledge and their own experiences and their own exposure to the situation, sufficient context to make sense of what they know. Context changes everything about the calculation. When you are one of three people who knows a certain thing, silence is rational because the value of your silence is high and the risk of speaking is uncertain. When you are one of 300 people who knows a version of that thing, and some of them are already speaking, and the investigators already have access to documents and recordings that provide corroborating context, the calculation changes entirely. Your silence is no longer protecting you. It is only protecting someone else. And protecting someone else at ongoing cost to yourself stops being rational the moment you understand that the protection is not being reciprocated. The jet story is being floated on March 1st, 2026, because someone understands at some level, that this is the moment that the calculation is changing for a significant number of people. The story is an attempt to influence that calculation, to remind people that there are still reasons to maintain the old arrangement, to suggest that the capacity for enforcement still exists, to plant enough doubt about whether the situation is truly as one-sided as it appears to be, to keep people from making the kind of moves that would accelerate and deepen what is already happening. And it is not a sign of strength. It is evidence of how clearly the people constructing it understand how vulnerable their position has become. Because here is the thing about power structures built on a fear and financial leverage, and the kind of carefully managed information control that characterized this particular operation for decades. They are extraordinarily resistant to external attack when they are functioning. They are extraordinarily fragile when the internal belief system that sustains them begins to crack. You cannot attack a well-maintained fear economy from the outside with any efficiency. The people inside it have too much invested in its continuation. But when the internal conditions change, when the money becomes uncertain, when the enforcement capacity becomes questionable, when the cost of continued loyalty begins to exceed the benefit, the structure does not just weaken, it inverts. When the same network that protected the center begins to expose it, the same relationships that maintain the silence begin to produce the information. The same people who had every incentive to stay quiet begin to find every incentive to speak. That inversion is what we are watching happen in slow motion right now. It does not look like the dramatic collapse that people imagine when they think about the end of something this large and this entrenched. It looks like a jet story being floated through entertainment blogs. It looks like vague claims about millions in ongoing income and assets still working. It looks like attempts to position family members as brand stewards. It looks like whisper campaigns aimed at maintaining internal prison dynamics. It looks, in other words, exactly like what it is. The maintenance behavior of a structure that has lost its structural integrity and is being held in place by increasingly desperate narrative management rather than genuine underlying strength. The empire does not announce its own collapse. It narrates against it, right up until the moment when the narrative can no longer hold the weight of the reality it is trying to cover, and the whole thing settles into what it actually is. Not with a bang, not with a moment of dramatic revelation. Just with the slow, inexorable settling of consequence around the shape of what was actually built here and what it actually cost the people who were caught inside it. What remains after that settling is not chaos. It is clarity. Clarity about where the power actually resided and how it was actually maintained. Clarity about what the people adjacent to it knew and when they knew it. Clarity about who benefited and under what conditions and at what cost to others. Clarity that does not go away. Which that does not soften by the time that does not respond to narrative management or image campaigns or stories about private jets generating millions from prison cells. The kind of clarity that becomes part of the permanent record. Not the celebrity record, not the entertainment industry gossip record, but the legal and historical record that does not edit itself based on what stories are being floated through which channels on which particular morning. March 1st, 2026. The jet is not making millions. The fear is not what it was. The silence is breaking in the places where it matters most. Not in public, not in headlines, but in the offices of attorneys, in the sealed conversations of investigators, in the private calculations of people who spent years maintaining an arrangement that they are now reconsidering at a fundamental level. And the story being circulated today, the one designed to suggest that none of this is actually happening, that the power is intact, that the money is flowing, that the machine is still running, that story is the clearest possible signal that all of it is happening, that the power is genuinely compromised, that the money is genuinely under pressure, and that the machine is running on narrative fumes rather than actual operational capacity. When real power speaks, it does not need to remind you that it exists. You already know. The fact that the reminder is being sent is the proof that the knowledge has begun to fade. And once that knowledge fades, once the fear economy loses its grip on the people who kept it operational, what comes next is not recovery. It is consequence. Slow, procedural, thorough, permanent consequence of the kind that does not trend on social media, but that reshapes everything it touches and leaves a record that cannot be erased, edited, or managed into something more comfortable than what it actually is. That is what is being settled right now. Not dramatically, not with ceremony, just with the patient, grinding forward movement of a legal and historical process that has its own momentum, and that does not require anyone's permission to continue. The empire is not falling. It has already fallen. What we are watching now is the settling of the dust. And in that settling, the shape of what it was actually built here is becoming visible in ways it never was before. And that visibility, that permanent, documented, unmanageable clarity, is the thing that no jet story, no matter how carefully constructed, can do anything about at all.